spoken a lot about Kimi and Toto. How does George respond to this? Because I saw a quote out of him today in which he sort of said, if I'd got to Formula One 5 years earlier, I'd probably have a couple of championships by now. And I fear a level of entitlement there, that he thinks this should naturally be his, or that he's starting to feel that, maybe Kimi's come in and has overtaken him in pure performance. And so there's that frustration in him of, well, I should already have been a champion. I don't know. There's just something that really,
how does that make sense? What does he mean by that?
I think he means if he'd been with Mercedes during their kind of glory days in the late 2010s, then because he beat Lewis when they were teammates, then maybe he might have beaten Lewis when Lewis was. And
I think that's probably going to come back to bite him in the ass, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, let's focus on the now, and let's just say, I don't think there's any room in this championship to be the kind of driver who only drives well on a clay court, as Toto put it, rather than like a hard tennis court. If you're going to say that, then start by beating your teammate right now, right? And I know that it was a bogey weekend.
Teammate's an all-rounder.
Yeah, and I know that it was a bogey weekend, and I don't think we should build too much pressure on George either, because this can happen, and it's a long season ahead. And actually, I think George will be the driver who's more consistent, constantly delivering points, whereas Kimi, we have seen him make some mistakes, so that might work in George's favor. But yeah, I don't know, maybe shouldn't have said that.
If he'd made it to Formula One in 2014, he wouldn't have got a seat at Williams like he did in 2019, because they had Massa and Bottas, and George isn't outperforming either one of them, which leaves him probably at a seat at Marussia or Caterham. And he wouldn't have got the Marussia seat because that was Bianchi, who was a Ferrari junior. Alexander Rossi was waiting in the wings for the other seat. Max Chilton was paying for that. And I don't think George had Max Chilton's money, which puts him in a Caterham. So he probably gets, half a season? If that. He's definitely not sliding into a Mercedes seat at that time, because you're not beating Hamilton at his peak or Rosberg. So a couple of championships from where? Because he wouldn't have won them in Formula E, because Buemi would have absolutely destroyed him and Verne would have destroyed him at their peak. So he gets what? Lucky if he gets an LMP2 title, maybe a couple of GT titles.
God, there is no holding back with you, though, is there?
No, I don't like that level of entitlement.
Yeah,
I get it.
Of like, if I'd been here 5 years earlier, I'd be a double world champion by now. Would you really?
I don't
think you would.
After 4 races this year, George Russell would not have expected the season to go the way it is going right now. He is currently 20 points behind his teammate Kimi Antonelli. He has just 1 race win to his name in Australia, and he has seen Kimi win 3 on the trot. This has led to a lot of conversation around George Russell. At the start of the year, there aren't many pundits who would have predicted the first 4 races to go in this manner. There aren't many pundits who would have expected George Russell to be trailing Kimi Antonelli after 4 races. And most importantly, I don't think there are many that would have expected George to be the first to have some kind of doubts around himself at this early stage in these regulations. But here we are, as we are looking at a lot of fans and a lot of experts like Will Buxton having a complete recalibration of how they view George Russell. Heading into 2026, George Russell was considered as one of the top 3 drivers in F1, alongside the likes of Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc. These 3 drivers, they stood out by the end of 2025. Yet, here we are in 2026, and apparently George is washed. Apparently he was never that good. Apparently he's being fraud checked by Kimi Antonelli. So what is the reality? Is George Russell just not that good? Or are we looking at a scenario where George Russell is the latest victim of F1's short-term memory? Let's take a look in this video as we try to answer this question. And to do that, we'll divide the video into a few parts. First of all, we'll take a look at how the 2026 season was expected to go. Then we'll take a look at how it is going right now. Next, we'll take a look at the story of the season beyond the numbers, because I think that is also very important. After this, we'll address 2 important questions. The first is, should George Russell be worried about where he is after 4 races? And then the most important one, was he never that good? So yes, let's get to it. First of all, let's talk about how the season was expected to go. Now, when we are talking about the 2026 season, by the pre-season test, it became very clear that Mercedes was going to be the benchmark this season. And I don't think that opinion has changed much. After the first 4 races, Mercedes has won all of them. Of course, there's a sprint that went McLaren's way. But if we have to give our pick on which team has been the benchmark, it's been Mercedes. And this was precisely why a bulk of F1 pundits and experts chose George Russell as the favorite to win the championship. He was the betting favorite as well heading into the year, and well, the first race of the season, it showed why he was the favorite. In the last few years, what he has specifically shown is an ability to extract the best result from the car. And that is something that he has continued to do. So if Mercedes was going to have the best car, George Russell was going to make the most of it and win the championship. Then comes the second part of the video where what's going on right now? Because not many would have predicted Kimi Antonelli to pick up a hat-trick of wins in the first 4 races. This was not part of anybody's script, and no one expected the 19-year-old kid to already start fulfilling a kind of potential that he had shown in parts in 2025. He was expected to have a bit of a learning curve, and it seems that the learning curve is still there, but the performances and the level at which he's performing, it is turning heads. And it is turning heads specifically for George, because after 4 races this season, he has only 1 win. Kimi Antonelli has 3. George won the race in Australia. That was where he showed something that was ideally expected to be a trend and a pattern for the rest of the year. Well, Australia has neither been a trend or a pattern. It has been more of an anomaly. Kimi Antonelli, since the race weekend in Australia, has picked up pole positions in all 3 races, in China, Japan and Miami, and he's picked up wins in all 3 of them as well. And this was not on the cards for anyone. Next up, in the third part of this video, I think it is important that we look beyond the numbers, because if we look plainly at the numbers, what we get is a scenario where George Russell is 1 pole position and 1 win. Kimi Antonelli has 3 wins and 3 pole positions. This shows one-way traffic. But is that the true story of the season? I think that is not the true story of the season, and the reason behind it is we have to look at each race individually. Australia, George managed it and we won. Then we went to China, and until the reliability issue in the qualifying, George was the one who had the edge over Kimi. He was comfortably the faster Mercedes driver throughout that race weekend until the qualifying reliability issue, and that derailed his weekend. Then we moved to Japan, and once again in Japan, George was leading the race and Kimi Antonelli was behind him. George pitted, and as soon as George came out, we had the safety car, and that handed the lead to Kimi, and George was stuck in traffic. Miami, however, was a wash. There, Kimi was clearly the faster driver and George had nothing for him. So overall, if you look at the 4 races we've had this season, the first race went to George. The second and the third race had fortune playing a major role. And that is something that is forgotten when we are talking about the story of the 2026 season. The story of the 2026 season is not essentially that George is not performing at a high level. The story is that George has been unlucky and Kimi has made the most of every opportunity presented to him. Now comes the fourth part of the video. Should George Russell be worried? And I think this is where he has to be very honest. And I think the answer is he should be worried. And it's not necessarily because of the gap between the 2 drivers in terms of points. 20 points is nothing when there's a 22 race calendar. That's not the issue. The issue is that at 19 years of age, Kimi Antonelli is performing at a level which you do not expect from 19-year-olds. Him having a very high level of performance is something that should not come as a surprise. Him having the consistency to extract the kind of performance race in, race out is where there should be concerns. And I think the race weekend in Miami was the first one where I feel George was a bit rattled. Not only was he unable to keep up with Kimi, but there was this sense that George was looking for excuses. The first excuse was that Miami tends to be his bogey circuit. Even though, except 2024, George had finished ahead of his teammate in each and every race. Ideally, for George, I don't think even he expected Kimi to mature to a certain level already. I think he knew what the potential is, and I think everyone knows what the potential is. But I don't think he expected Kimi to be right there with him after the kind of season he had in 2025. It was a big ask, and it is still a big ask to expect Kimi to fight George Russell in the championship. However, he is currently doing so, and he's stringing together a very impressive season. And for George, it is time that he pulls up his socks and becomes a bit more cerebral in the way he approaches this partnership and this championship battle. And now comes the final aspect of this video. Was George Russell never that good? Is he being fraud checked? Now, I think if we are going to make these assumptions and judgments about a driver like George, I think to do that, first of all, we need to take a look at his entire career. George Russell made his debut in Formula 1 in 2019. And before making his debut, he beat Lando Norris to become the F2 champion. Yes, Lando Norris, the reigning Formula 1 champion. That is the driver that George Russell beat in a straight fight. Then he made his debut with Williams in 2019. And from 2019 to 2021, I think he overstayed at Williams for those 3 years. But during those 3 years, George Russell made a significant impact. During the time, he became known as Mr. Saturday. because he continued to drag his Williams into Q2 in races and on tracks where Williams had no business being in Q2. That was how impressive he was being. Then came the 2020 season and he got a one-off opportunity to drive a Mercedes because Lewis Hamilton caught COVID. On just his first appearance, without any preparation or anything, George Russell was on his way to cruise to a win. With Valtteri Bottas in the other car, George Russell had no issues. He was cruising to a win. But then misfortune struck and the issues with the pit wall and strategy and everything that could go wrong went wrong and he ended up not winning. But that was not all. Then came the 2021 season and George Russell picked up a P2 finish with a Williams in the 2021 Belgian Grand Prix, and he did so by qualifying on the front row with the Williams. And the drivers he beat the likes of Lewis Hamilton, who was driving a Mercedes and fighting for the championship. So that should tell you how impressive he was being. And he did all of this before he was promoted to Mercedes in 2022. From 2022 to 2024, George Russell ended up beating Lewis Hamilton twice in 3 years. And if we look back at the data, it is quite clear that George was the better driver out of the two. So George ended up outperforming a 7-time world champion. Then came 2025 and George took another step. With Kimi Antonelli alongside him, George became more consistent and he took over as the team leader. He picked up multiple race wins, and the season that he compiled, at least in my view, he was one of the top 3 drivers in F1 in 2025 alongside Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc. So essentially this is the driver that we are talking about right now, a driver that has been probably one of the front runners since 2022 when he graduated to Mercedes, and he's been doing so consistently. So that begs the question, why are we looking at a discourse where George Russell is being counted out? I think this comes down to 2 things. First is a lot of F1 pundits and experts, they have this tendency to give sensational headlines, and we are looking at that time where a lot of stuff that is being said by a lot of these experts, it's intentionally outrageous. There's literally no tact, no thought behind it. It's just what is trending this weekend, so we are going to give our view on that. We are not going to sit back and think and make our logical calls. Unfortunately, I think Will Buxton's comments about George Russell, it falls in the same category. Then if we talk about fans, and fans again, they also have very short-term memory. The entire discourse that we see about any driver or a team, it is essentially based on a memory span of just one race weekend, not more than that. And that is the unfortunate reality. Stuff like this is disingenuous. If in 2026, Kimi Antonelli ends up beating George Russell to win the championship, it is a reflection on Kimi Antonelli, not on George Russell, because it shows that Kimi is a once-in-a-generation talent that is already performing at a level of a world champion at 19 years of age. It doesn't mean that George has stopped being a good driver. It just means that he's teamed up with a sensational talent who is probably going to have a much higher peak than even any top-level driver does. So yes, we have to look at things on those parameters. The story of the 2026 season is not that George Russell is washed or is he exposed. The story of the 2026 F1 season is that F1 has discovered a once-in-a-generation talent in Kimi Antonelli, and that is how we should view it. Unfortunately, people don't, but that's the sad reality of F1 discourse. So yeah, that's my take on the whole thing. Do let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.